the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Canada's two Michaels continue to be locked away in China, becoming political pawns in a diplomatic deadlock and a game that's hard to win. It's been almost 3 years since former diplomat Michael Kovrig and entrepreneur Michael Spavor were arrested by the Chinese Communist Party. The move was seen as retaliation against Canada's arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who's currently standing trial for possible extradition to the US. Meanwhile, Michael Spavor has received an 11-year sentence on allegations of espionage, and Kovrig could be sentenced at any time. The recent ruling comes just as Wanzhou's US extradition hearing is in its final stretch in Canadian court, a case that experts say will further darken diplomatic ties between Beijing and Ottawa. But as Star reporter Joanna Chiu reports, this form of hostage-taking and death threat diplomacy is not new. So why is no one talking about the many other Canadians that have been taken as political prisoners by the Chinese Communist Party? And what's at play when it comes to diplomacy between China and the West? Joanna is joining me on This Matters to help untangle some of this. Joanna Chiu is a Vancouver-based reporter covering both Canada-China relations and current affairs on the West Coast for The Star, as well as the author of the soon-to-be-released book, China Unbound. Hi, Joanna. Thanks for being on the podcast with me.
Hi, Saba.
So it's been more than 3 years since the two Michaels have been in jail. Can we first go back a little in time to talk about how this unfolded to where we are now?
Well, so Meng Wanzhou, as you know, she's Huawei Technologies CFO. And as we've explained in our stories for the Toronto Star, she is basically royalty in China. Huawei is just the number one private company, technology company, and Beijing just sees it as its national champion. And Meng Wanzhou is basically one of its just leading figures in the country. So when she was arrested by Canadian authorities, because of an extradition request from the US Justice Department, the Chinese Communist Party saw it just as the gravest insult. And they also saw it as an escalation of conflict or a challenge to China from directly the United States, but also it seems more broadly kind of like the Western world. So there's just a lot of big picture things at play here. So this happened in December 2018, and just days after, the two Michaels were arrested in China. They were both living there. And Trudeau said that Chinese officials made it really clear right from the beginning that their arrests were in direct relation to Meng, and that China was in fact basically using them as hostages, as leverage to push for Canada to stop the process and release Meng.
Right. And despite China officially kind of saying that the two events are not related, but the diplomatic signaling sort of contradicts that, right?
Yeah, and actually on and off, Chinese ambassadors officials, I don't know if they slipped or they did it deliberately. They seem to speak in a way that made it pretty clear that, in fact, they are related. Some of the language has been quite threatening. And like I said, the Prime Minister said that Chinese officials, speaking with Canadian officials, highlighted a pretty obvious link between the arrest of the two Canadians and the RCMP's arrest of Meng in Vancouver.
Right. And I was reading a bit of this in your book as well. I believe you were friends with Michael Kovrig, one of the two Michaels. This must have been quite a challenging thing to sort of process in that context, right?
Yeah, I guess as soon as I heard he was arrested, I was in the office in Vancouver, and I just kind of knew that it wasn't going to be a simple thing that would blow over, that this would be a long, drawn out process. And now Michael Spavor, the entrepreneur from Alberta, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, which again, it's very long and very just shocking, but to people who follow Chinese politics and kind of know about the basics of its legal system, it's not surprising because China has done it in the past, and the men were accused of some serious national security violations, and a sentence of around 10 years is pretty standard. So I guess I knew, and a lot of people who were familiar with the Chinese legal system knew it was going to be pretty serious, and that Beijing was really committed to basically using these men as political pawns to achieve what it wanted.
And you mentioned in your book as well that death threat and hostage diplomacy has long been conducted by the Chinese Communist Party. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Mm-hmm. So for decades, hundreds of political prisoners were taken in China, and a lot of them actually have foreign citizenship, or they only have foreign citizenship. So I argue, and I found because of my research that a lot of these political prisoners, they are of Asian descent. Like me, they may have been born in a place like Hong Kong or Taiwan, even if they weren't born in mainland China. And basically, the Chinese government sees anyone of Chinese descent as Chinese and tries to take away their rights and just to insist that they're Chinese people. But I think Western governments have been complicit in this, and people around the world as well in Western countries have been complicit in this because these cases have not got nearly the same attention as the cases of the two Michaels and Robert Schellenberg, who's facing the death sentence. I think in Canada, I think it's fair to say that the two Michaels are basically a household name that most people would have heard about their tragic situation. But I'm pretty certain that if you ask an average Canadian, do you know Hussein Salil, that most would have no idea what his case is about. Actually, he is Canadian, Hussein Salil. He was visiting his wife's family in Uzbekistan in 2006 on a Canadian passport. But because of China's different ties to allies in its neighborhood, the Uzbekistan local police arrested him, sent him to China, and he has been in jail since 2006. And even though he's Canadian, Chinese authorities have denied the Canadian embassy officials from seeing him. And no one actually knows what crime, if any, he has committed. And he's basically been in jail since 2006 for 15 years, and people don't know if he's alive or not. So cases like this, I think talking to his family representatives, they feel that public attention and pressure would make a difference, but they find it heartbreaking that compared to the three Canadian men who all happen to be white, that people like Hussein Salil are basically forgotten. And we've highlighted in our articles other examples, people who are facing a death sentence and actually directly linked to the Meng Wanzhou case. I am ashamed to admit that I am one of those Canadians who did not know that actually 3 other Canadians, in addition to Robert Schellenberg, who we hear about, did receive the death sentence for drug-related charges within 2 years after Meng Wanzhou's arrest in 2018. And there is suspicion, and Canadian officials suspect that their cases are also tied to Meng Wanzhou case, that China did impose those death sentences on the 3 Canadians just to increase the pressure on Canada. So I will read those names because I think that many of us aren't aware of them, like I was. So it's Ye Jianhui, Xu Weihong, and Fan Wei. They all face death. They are all Canadians, but they aren't white. And basically, I had to do a pretty deep Google search to find information about their cases, and there's very little written about them. And even though their circumstances are quite similar to Robert Schellenberg's, and when his appeal of his death sentence failed, it was major news, like top news, basically in every Canadian publication. But few of those stories even mention that, in fact, there's a total of 4 Canadians facing a death sentence within a short time of Meng Wanzhou's arrest in Canada.
We'll be right back. I must admit that I was also shocked to just find out through your work and through more research that I did that the 2 Michaels aren't the only Canadians imprisoned as a sort of measure of retaliatory arrest. But like you said, they are non-white, they're racialized Canadians. And we haven't seen the same global urgency or frankly any conversation around this. What does that say about the lens through which the Western world views political arrests and human rights abuses in other parts of the world and how they conduct their diplomacy with those countries?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of 2 factors. I think the Chinese government has really promoted this idea that if you have a Chinese name, a Chinese looking face, even an East Asian looking face, you're basically Chinese and you don't have the same rights as foreigners. But at the same time, it's not this narrative that the Chinese government has unilaterally imposed on the world. I think it's kind of drawing on the very deep-seated prejudices that people have around the world against people who are racialized. So when we see a name that's non-white, we think, oh, they're not as Canadian as a white Canadian. I think that's unfortunately kind of like an ugly truth that a lot of people believe, and myself included. Sometimes when I see a Chinese name or just a non-white name, I check and I question oh, are they a Canadian citizen? Or you think maybe this is a issue that's more of a domestic issue just because this person appears racialized and you have this doubt about whether they're Canadian. So these cases are widely ignored because of, I think, this kind of systemic racism and unconscious biases that many people have. I would say that most people have in the West. So it's been a pattern because I was actually based in Beijing covering human rights. So just countless cases came across my desk. I was reporting on them, and I would see the kind of attention that would be different when I was reporting on human rights abuses or an arrest of a foreigner of Asian descent versus a foreigner who is white. Yeah. And actually, to be honest, like it affects my safety. It affects the safety of journalists who are not white in China. When we do reporting on the ground there, we know for a fact that we are more at risk. One, because Chinese police see us as Chinese, and also because we know that if something were to happen to us, our cases would get a lot less attention in the Western media and in the Western world. So there'd be less pressure on Beijing to treat us fairly. So this is something that's kind of an obvious fact.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Even in Pakistan, reporting from there as a local reporter, I've seen that kind of dichotomy in how these incidents are treated or focused on. So I can understand that. Joanna, you also argue in your book that Canada and other countries should have seen this coming, this situation, this deadlock. It wasn't unexpected. Why is that?
Yeah, like I said, because human rights abuses have been happening for decades, and Canada and other nations, I wouldn't say they were ignorant of these things happening, or they were ignorant of how foreigners could equally get ensnared in China's very opaque legal system where there is a death penalty. I think it was a case where a lot of countries had this kind of naive optimism that they could have a dual track approach to working with China, where on the one hand, they could advocate for the rule of law and publicly condemn China's ongoing human rights abuses, but on the other hand, they could try to go on trade missions, go to economic summits, arrange state visits in hopes of striking lucrative trade or investment deals with the Chinese government. And often on these visits and negotiations, human rights and rule of law wouldn't come up at all. And there's the idea that criticizing one wouldn't affect these deals. But with what happened as these tensions between Canada and China and other countries came to a head in the last couple of years, it has affected the economic relationship. China has introduced trade tariffs, kind of tariffs on Canadian goods like pork and canola as a way to bring the pressure into the economic sphere as well. And this seemed to really take countries by surprise. This has happened in Australia, to some extent in Europe, whenever basically China feels like criticism went over a line to be very offensive and deserving of some retaliation. So it's come to this point where it seems like a lot of governments see it coming when they should have. At the same time, I wouldn't say that the aggression is entirely one-sided. In my book, I'm pretty critical of how, for example, the White House, particularly the Trump administration, handled increasing tensions with China, where they would just engage in this war of words that was quite, I would say, irresponsible, because often it lumped together the Chinese people and stoked xenophobia and racism against people of Chinese descent at the same time as it was trying to attack China. Their language would be really loaded and really quite anti-communist, as if they were really wanting to emphasize that China's a communist regime and that's why they're doing this. And we've seen this kind of happen and be present in Canada and Canadian politics as well. So in the absence of this long promised new strategy on dealing with China and having more kind of nuanced and well-informed diplomatic relation strategy with China, we've also seen just a lot of kind of fear-mongering and scapegoating among Canadian politicians when they're talking about China too.
And like you said, then it becomes a race-based narrative rather than seen in the context of state policies and bilateral relations.
And when it becomes race-based, then again, we also ignore and we fail to protect Canadians of Chinese descent when the conversation just gets so heated to a point where it's just not based on the realities, and that it kind of gets swept up in this kind of hate, because a lot of Chinese political prisoners, like I said, are people who are Canadian of Asian descent or non-white descent. And they're not only being ignored when our conversation becomes heated to the point of xenophobic, we're also hurting these Canadians.
Mm-hmm. And now that this predicament of the two Michaels has highlighted the need for international action on this, do you see the same level of proactivity might happen now to help other political prisoners in China and not just a particular demographic, as you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in a way, it's not all negative because of the huge public pressure around the two Michaels. I think a lot of governments have done more than they did in the past. So Canada led a coalition of more than 50 countries to sign a declaration against arbitrary detentions in general. And this does, it's not legally binding, but it does set a precedent. It does send a strong message to countries that do engage in arbitrary arrests for political means. So maybe some of these gains and this increase in communication among different countries about what to do with increasing authoritarianism in China will benefit anyone who finds themselves in difficult situations in China. But in a way, it has been still too little, too late. It seems that there's this big question, like, what can Canada do? What can countries do? And I don't think it's up to the general public to kind of give an answer. I think there has been a lot of suggestions from legal experts, from professors, experts on China, but we haven't been getting real proposals and concrete actions from governments on how to counter and what is happening.
Thank you so much for your time and your insight, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you.
I was talking to Joanna Chiu, who covers Canada-China relations and current affairs on the West Coast for the Toronto Star. She's also the author of the soon-to-be-released book, China Unbound. So keep an eye out for that. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattington. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattington. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.